All right, we'll get a warm-up in here when you're ready. Looks like we got enough space. If you're okay getting on the ground, you can get on the ground. If you're better off in the chair, you can definitely sit in the chair. If it's too much work, you don't want to cause yourself more damage. That's not the goal here.
Hey, Ben.
Come on down.
Just a room over here.
Room right there. So for now, let's start breathing. Just breathe. This is all about breathing. It's the most important part of everything we're doing here is the breathing process. It's a camping mat, that's why. Probably got more cushion though. So with the breath, from the belly, try to expand the chest. What we're trying to do today is find restriction in our breathing. A lot of us have arthritis developing in the spine, even if you don't feel it, so we're trying to push into that with the breath. So we're not just going tall with the shoulders, we're kind of going wide in the rib cage, breathing widthwise and front to back. So we're not pinching the shoulder blades back with the breath, we're trying to expand that space in between the spine and the shoulder blades. So let's hear the breaths. Big inhale, get about 30. Belly draws in, rib cage expands, let it out. I can feel as I fill up, there's a little bit lower left rib that feels out there. So I'm actually going to concentrate on breathing into where I feel a little bit of restriction. So it might be different for you where you feel it. Find that spot and you're trying to drive it out. Might feel like you can't get all that air in. Might feel a little restricted when you're breathing. That's good. We're trying to find that garbage, that restriction, that tight fascia that's compressing us. Trying to expand it. And we have to use our whole body to do that. We can't just, raise half of it. You have to anchor and pull. Anchor is the big word we'll be talking about today. It won't make sense right away, but anchor, remember that. You counting, Bruce? What are we on?
5.
5? It's more than 5. Let's give me 10 more, just big rhythmic breaths. In through the nose, out through the mouth. And if your tailbone feels kind of tucked underneath you, just kind of lift yourself up, stack more on top of your hips. Might feel a little fatigue right there in that, what we call the psoas muscle. So we're using that to hinge a little bit. That's going to engage our pelvic floor, which is another muscle that helps expand and fill volume in our torso. Diaphragm, pelvic floor, and they're really similar looking structures. Give me 2 more breaths. Inhale. It's exhausting, right? There's a lot of muscles that fight you. And with these masks and everything we're doing, we're breathing a lot from our shoulders, using accessory breathing. So now we're targeting other muscles, diaphragm, pelvic floor, spinal muscles. Inhale, hold. Let's hold for like 15 seconds. Find that tight spot. Breathe into it. Get that little bit of stretch. Might feel it on both sides, might be more one side. Just hold that expansion right in there. Try to think about calming your heart down. Just hold that breath in. 5 more seconds, hold. It's hard to talk while you're holding your breath. Exhale, let it out. Let's bring the feet up here. It's going to force you to hinge a little bit more at the hips. Kind of keep the chest broad. Remember, we're not trying to pinch back. Everyone thinks posture class, so they're automatically doing that. We want to pull in more. So pull yourself on top of your hips, widen everything. Let's do a couple breaths here. Put your elbows in front of your knees and just squeeze. So the elbows are driving out, knees are driving in. This is to help you feel a little bit of that anchoring process we'll get into later. A couple breaths there. You can do the same thing there, just maybe lean forward, don't hurt yourself. You can even just use your forearms if you can't get your knees there. Same thing here, wrap around. You can also do this in a squat position, but we won't get that crazy today. Pushing the knees out now. This is what we call an outward anchor. So the hips are driving out. I say knees, but it really should be from that hip joint that's doing the work. Pushing out. Pushing in. And we're going to translate that into standing, but first we're going to try kneeling. So find yourself in a kneeling position. You can stay on the chair. Just bring your inner thighs together. So feet kind of wide. And we're squeezing the inner thighs together. So don't go too wide with that. I'm trying to get narrow because it's going to help us feel this inner thigh squeeze that helps take the, if you watch my thumbs, so when I squeeze, they just turn in just a little bit. That's all we're trying to get, is that little bit of inward rotation. It's going to activate here. That's going to help us drive our spine upwards and help us with the breathing. Then to keep you from breathing from your shoulders, we're going to go into what's called long wing. So just open up, kind of like you're gripping a basketball. Just go wide here. Try to get a little more weight in your front of your knees so you can kind of pick your toes up in the back. A couple breaths there. So you're pulling your shoulders down as the breath dries up. We're trying to keep the neck long. If you're falling forward, you're doing it right. Because you want to be right there. It really helps engage that psoas muscle, which is a big part of our anchoring process. A little wider with the feet maybe. The wider the feet, the more the hips turn in. That's why we're going over that. Little cramp, that's good. A couple breaths here. And before, we're just kind of going in and out. Now try to inhale like you're a balloon. You don't want to let the air out because the balloon shrinks. So you're inhaling a little bit, expanding length, width. Add a little bit more. Each inhale is gonna, you're like, why is she breathing so heavy? Because she's doing it right. It should be exhausting. It should be like instantaneous sweat. The more you do this, it's a big learning curve. It gets harder, but the more corrective. I'm doing this for 5 years, and I'm always learning something a little bit more. Good. Go here, short wing. A couple more breaths. Get the stretch here in the neck, pec. Long wing. Short wing. So everything's so lengthened now that you should feel a lot of stretch in that shoulder. If you're kind of compressed, you're like, I don't feel anything. Yeah. If we're tall, we get that nice isolated motion in the shoulder. Good. Let's bring our right foot. Try to keep that inner thigh squeeze going. Bring that right one up. And then scoop that. You can take that long wing, scoop it here. Keep that. Now pretend like you actually got a basketball. Maybe a softball, large grapefruit. Bring it overhead. Don't let your spine bend. Try to just keep it in your shoulders. You should hit a wall right about here that's really shaky. Breathe into it. Good. Come back down to this long wing. Take your left hand, you're going to cross it over a little bit. Bring the right up to it so you're at a bit of an angle. Breath in there. Expand. Try not to let your shoulders too hiked up. Come back down. Let's do that left. Make sure you kind of squeeze and stack. Even bringing that hip up should be a little tough. That's sphere of tension right there. Spread the fingers as wide as you can, but also curling at the same time. Just helps connect that whole kinetic chain, everything together. Bring it overhead. Got to drive your hips back maybe a little bit when you're doing that, so you're hinging in this kneeling position. Just get a little stretch right there in your left hip. Stretch in the right front hip. Back to long wing. Now we're going to take the right, bring it across the body. The more lengthened you are, the more you're going to really feel this everywhere. Especially if we got injuries, we want this controlled motion. The more length, the more we stiffen our spine, the less we're going to hurt ourselves, and the more we're going to strengthen our spine to prevent injury in the future. Good. Push up out of that position. Standing time. Anyone watch the fighting fascia video? This is all from that. And we're recording, so you'll have it for later. So we're gonna just do some variations of what was on the video. Let's start about shoulder width apart with the feet. Don't let them be too far out. You don't want them too far in, just straight ahead. This is what we call the measuring stick hands. You're gonna put it right there on your pelvis, pinkies on your pelvis, thumbs on your ribs, pulling that belly into the spine, but also getting some length. What we don't want to see is this, because then I did a lot of motion from the spine versus straight length from the spine. We don't want to be pinching the shoulder blades back. We actually want to be pulling them down and apart. That's a muscle called your serratus anterior, runs here, pulls them down and out. A lot of us are here all day long, and then we breathe from there 20, 30,000 times a day. You wonder why you have headaches and arthritis in your neck. That's why. Breathe from the anchor. This mystical anchor that we're talking about. So the anchor, we'll feel it better when we're standing, is the pelvis and the hips are pulling down, and the spine is lifting up. So it's two adversing forces. A lot of us want to decompress with our shoulders, which only does half the work. And you don't really feel that as much, right? You don't feel that tug of war that we're going for. From the feet to the hands, back to the skull, lifting. Take it easy. This is just the warm-up. Hip hugger right here. Platter on the hips. Squeeze those inner thighs together. Not the knees, right? We don't want to be shrinking. Maintain that height. Scoop up to that sphere again. And pretend like you're pushing that away from your mid-back. So you should feel your neck. You should sound funny like this. And then I want you to pull the hips back. Sink into it a little bit. Big inhale. Widen your rib cage. Exhale. Try this little platter and sink a little deeper. So inhale, we're widening. Exhale, we're hinging, raising the arms. Elbows moving away from your hips. Inhale, expand. Exhale, lengthen. Inhale, expansion. Exhale, really shaky. Let's do one more. And then slowly come up out of it. Coming up out of that is important too. When we get here, you just want to kind of extend into it, use the spine. The whole goal is to kind of overtrain the spine here to be a stabilizing structure. We're so used to bending at the spine all day long that the hips become very rigid and they don't move anymore. So later in life, what happens, we're here, you bend down to pick up a pencil, this disc blows and you're stuck here in hip flexion. Then you realize how little your hips actually move when the spine is stiff. You see these guys at the mall? That's their hip motion. That's what we're trying to work on today. Getting more motion here, because we're so used to bending here. That low lumbar spine, SI joint. So think about that when you're anchoring. We're stabilizing it. Psoas is the best stabilizer of that lumbar spine and pelvis. Just kind of hold it so it doesn't move. It's so used to moving. We want the motion to happen here. We need to get it going there. All right, let's try that again. Let's go narrow. Big toes together. And you just want to gauge this on how you feel. Heels a little bit apart, so it's kind of like a triangle. If it's too far away, I notice that my knees do too much of the rotation. We want it from the hips. And you should also be able to, the 3 points of contact, which if you're watching the foundation training videos, they go into that a little bit. For today, just try to keep both your outside of the foot and the inside kind of down. Ball the big toe, ball the little toe. And you are gripping the ground, and you'll feel that more. But we could talk a lot about the feet. We don't want to get lost in the weeds, though. So same thing as before. Inner thighs squeezing together. You can do this hip hugger. Just reminds us to pull those hips inwards. And that's where the glutes kind of engage a little bit. We don't want to overglute. A lot of us squeeze and we shrink. First, we're activating that psoas. Then the glutes are tucking the pelvis. That's what we call posterior pelvic tilt. And I feel that a lot in my skull when I do that, right? It's that lift. So you don't want to tuck where you shrink. If anything that causes you to shrink, you did it wrong. All right, let's move on. Right here, set that neck, get that neck really long. You see that subtle little change where I kind of pull my shoulders down, lift the back of my skull. That's to keep me from doing that, right? Where I'm trying to wear my shoulders as earrings, because we want not the spine to do the work, not the shoulder blade to do the work, but the shoulder. Use your shoulder, not your shoulder. Hinge. You won't be able to get as deep here when it's narrow. It's a little harder. Inhale, expand.
Exhale, hinge. Inhale, expand. Maybe you'll feel one inner thigh over the other here. My left is really angry. I need this more than you guys. One more, expand. Sink a little deeper. Slow and control, bring the hands back to the hips. Feel how tough that could be coming out of that position? It's almost the hardest part. You get there, you get all that length, and you just kind of let it go. So we're trying to overtrain you how to pick stuff up. Two biggest things, breathing and bending. We bend 4,000 times a day. So that's either from the spine or it could be from the hips. So subtle changes, even what we do most often. And of course, breathing, because 4,000 pales into 20,000 breaths you take. This is called the woodpecker. So the left foot forward, right foot back. These are all on the handout that I got a few of somewhere. If not, it's online, or I'll make you a copy. Pushing that back heel up, so that toe's lifting you, lengthening you, setting you on top of your hips. Chest is nice and broad. Get that measuring stick hands, remind you to engage. It's just a little reminder. Oh yeah, I'm supposed to be tightening. I'm not supposed to be hyperextending or pulling everything forward. And maybe we'll have a little model like Bruce come up and show us. Sure. Later. Come up here, same thing, set that neck. This one's fun, so we're gonna hinge over that front knee. So keep those hands up.
What do you mean by setting the neck?
So what I mean by setting the neck is I am pushing my hands away from my mid-back. You see how my neck gets all long there versus kind of there? So that legs are like a pair of scissors,
Okay.
closing. See how that gets me? Inner thighs are squeezing towards each other.
Okay.
Should feel like front hamstring, hip flexor on the right. And then I do the neck last. A lot of people think neck first. We got to set the anchor first. And then that neck where the back of the skull is lifting. I'm trying to pull my shoulders down as my spine gets longer. There I feel really lengthened. And when I breathe, oh, it's hard. It should be hard when you breathe. Oh, you're like, oh, I'm using all these muscles I'm not used to using. And then you hinge over top. Good. Let's do a couple of rotations off to the left. Try to keep it really subtle. Get those pinkies together there, Cheryl. It helps. It doesn't make sense. Just do it. That's why you have the chair next to you in case you need it. Should get a little burny on the left hip. That hip is doing the work because we've lengthened that lumbar spine, so now our spine's not twisting. It's more the hips. Sink a little deeper. And we're going to take this overhead. Try to just lift from the legs. Keep your belly in. Ooh, nice shaky wall there. I'm sweating. Let's bring that back down. Come back to the center. And then when you come back up, you'll kind of notice what you lost. You're like, if your shoulders are up here, you're like, oh, was I that way the whole time? It'll get better. Switch it up. That's one thing I've learned is coming out of the position kind of reminds you what you've lost during the exercise. Sometimes you're like, yeah, I'm doing great. Doing great. And then like stand up and you're like, oh, I was there. It's not good. So less is more. Don't think so much yoga. Think about finding the tension earlier in the position. Again, we're protecting our joints. We're not trying to get, yoga helps you get better at yoga is what I like to say. Not against yoga, but this is rehab, right? Strengthening our spine, teaching us to move better for life. Of course, what you're doing in the gym and everything like that. Make sure that back toe parallel, facing forward. We don't want that hip too turned out. There is an exercise where we do that. We might get into today. Lengthen, squeeze. You're like, this is so much different stuff, but all these positions, same stuff repeated, right? You just get better at it. And you'll add more steps you go. I like to scoop versus using the deltoids. A lot of people come here. See the difference when I scoop, my shoulders stay down, my neck stays longer. A lot of us kind of want to go here. Where the shoulders come up, the deltoid is using too much. So that scoop, ooh, that feels good, right? Get that lat stretch from your hip. Pulls up. And then you set that neck, so I'm kind of squeezing my glutes. I get like a big stretch here. Just helps me set more length in the spine for when I do hinge. I just try to keep as much as I can. Big hamstring stretch on the right. Push into that so the hips are driving away from the hands. And then you rotate. So that more tension you've built up before you rotate, the more you're going to hate this. And you'll get better at finding that tension. The more you do this, the harder it gets. There's no roof. So 5 minutes in the morning can do a lot of work. Stay there, sink a little bit deeper. As I'm raising, I can really feel that lat stretch as I drive the hips away. And then I bring it up overhead. So that spiral really helps attack one side of the spine. Our spines tend to be twisted. So you might notice left versus right is a little tougher. This way is harder for me. So I'm going to spend a little extra longer here. Think about pushing your hands up, legs squeezing towards each other. Looking really good, Bruce. A little bend in that right knee. You don't want to lock it out completely. If you lock it out completely, the tension goes into the calf. You want it here. Stretch. Tension is stretching. Like, do you have a question? Shake it off. That was a lot. Where'd my tea go? There's water back there if you need it. Questions? Probably a lot of questions. Bruce, you've been doing this for a while. Give us some words of wisdom.
Oh, I'd have to get back to you on that.
I was hoping Jeremy would come. He does a lot of breath work.
Chris, you're new on that. What's the best way to access this stuff online for you?
So foundationtraining.com is the guys that created this. They have a subscription-based thing where you can, I think it's $15 a month. And they kind of start you at the beginning and work your way through. It's a lot of material. I've bought some of their stuff in the past. That's what we were doing in the spring. We were showing some of their videos. That was the core elements, which was like really basic but in depth. I just felt like I lost people because it was too much material. Yeah. So we're trying to keep it simple.
You have a website that...
Yeah, it's right here.
Yeah.
It's actually just Exile Strong now.
Oh.
I made the name shorter, but the link on the handouts will take you to a playlist that I start people on just breathing, right? Focusing on breathing. If we could get better at breathing, we get better at so much stuff. So let's go back to the ground. Go back to the easy part. The easy part. We'll just add a little more depth, a little more color.
Should I try it like that?
Maybe if you could help her get down, I think it'd be good for you.
We were talking about you.
Talk about me.
You're a funny person.
You're a comedian but don't know it.
I'm just so dry.
Very dry.
That's what makes it funny.
And getting up and off the ground, maybe we'll talk about that today too, because that is one of those things that we just do a lot. We do it fast and we don't think about it. But there's ways to do it, especially if you're falling, hurting yourself. It's good to have that in mind so you know how to get up and off the ground. Keeping that spine, because if you injure a disc or a joint, your spine's gonna be really stiff. So you need to have that kind of strength elsewhere to do it. Because once you lose that kind of flexion extension of that spine always helping you out, you notice that just like as people injure the back, they get stuck in that position. It's hard to walk. So getting that hip motion, getting that true shoulder motion. Even people who they think they have a lot of range of motion can have really restricted joints. I know because I see them in the office. They teach yoga all day. They're super bendy, but they're still very restricted. I'm like, well, you're coming to see me 3 times a week, so obviously there's a problem we're not addressing. You're not coming here for my jokes. So I like to hold onto the feet a little bit, so that keeps me from raising the shoulders. I'm just going to break this down nice and slowly. Some of the cues I do, just to give you some ideas, because I breathe through my shoulders. We kind of all do. So there's the SCM, this big one here in the front, the upper traps. All these are very tight on you. A suboccipital. These all help us breathe when we're in fear mode. So when we're breathing when we're in fear mode, sometimes it could put us into stress mode, right? So is it a mechanical cause, or you're kind of stuck in this emotional and physical stress that are feeding off each other? We have no control over emotional usually, so we can work on the physical and mechanical that could help us emotionally. Sometimes you get that breath from your belly and you're just, oh, you feel better. Kind of emotional change, but physically you shut off the tight shoulders because your autonomic nervous system, which happens automatically, can be turned off. There's two divisions. There's sympathetic, which is not bad. It's just a lot of us are stuck there. And there's parasympathetic, where your heart slows down, your gut slows down. Your gut has a big relation to your immune system. So we can kind of tie breathing into a lot of different diseases we're facing, just with how we're breathing. So we can feed into fear, or we can feed into relaxing and strengthening our spines. That's why I hold on. That's a long explanation for why I hold on to my feet. Keeping those shoulders down. So then, almost like from my hips, I'm pushing with my butt. I'm like pushing into the mat, and my head is getting a little taller with those breaths. So the rib cage is expanding, kind of 360-degree expansion. Think of it like Chinese finger traps. You put your fingers in there, and you're like, oh, you can't pull it apart. That's what you're doing. Your rib cage is going both directions, up and down. And then wide. That's that serratus anterior muscle we talked about, which is that pulls the shoulder blades. There's lots of different serratus muscles, and they're all generally weak. Unless you're a CrossFitter, your serratus anterior is usually really overdeveloped. But the serratus posterior and inferior, a lot of like COPD cases, they're atrophied, they're not using. So there are accessory muscles that we don't tap into, and those are two of them. And of course the diaphragm and the pelvic floor. So we're kind of hitting all four of those when we breathe like that. We're shutting off the muscles that want to work, we're activating the ones that are inhibited. And when you're sleeping at night, guess what happens? Your body plays into its dominances. So you're going to breathe, you're going to accessory muscle breathe all night long. So then the only way to do it is to train yourself out of it. You've got to take the tension out of what's tight, engage what's weak. It's like going to the gym. It's a process, you know. You're not going to have abs your first day. And a lot of these muscles get tired really fast because they've just never been activated. So the nerves going to these muscles are usually really thin, so the more we work them, get your brain talking to your body, this will all make more sense. So this position, we talked about the anchor a little bit when standing. So I'm thinking about pulling my knees in, but you see what happens when I pull my knees in? I kind of turtle up a little bit. So you don't want that to happen. It's not just the knees going to each other. We want the hips to pull in as we pull into length. So either I'm not shrinking or I'm thinking about getting taller. And then it's from the hips. You might even feel it right in there. A lot of us have like impingement syndrome. That's where that hip is just not quite in the socket as it should be. Tends to rotate out a little bit. So when we're doing that, we're actually pulling it into that socket a little bit. So that's what I was doing there with just kind of reminding myself to squeeze. So it's not just about activating the inner thigh, it's a whole body engagement. You can even do it here if you feel like you round too much. Sometimes that rounding is good. I actually have to teach a lot of people to go into rounding because they're so used to being here. They got what I call the runway model look. The shoulders are up and back and rolled back. And they're so pinched in, but that's so much spine motion. It's actually compressing the spine. So sometimes you got to round and lengthen. That makes sense, to get into that right position. And that's good here. I like that position because you kind of almost have to be a little rounded. And then an outward anchor, same thing. I'm not pushing in or shrinking, I'm lengthening. Kind of feel it in the same joint though. So if you're watching the foundation training videos, they'll talk about that a lot. Anchor your hips. They don't spend enough time on it, I don't think. They just tell you to anchor and you're like, what? But anchoring it's a big, broad topic. That makes sense over the hips though? Yeah. Let's go to the kneeling position. A lot of the laying stuff we did last time in the spring, that'll help you feel that anchor more. Sometimes when we get to the standing, it's what people want to do most, but it's easier to mess up there. When we're grounded, it's good, especially when our knees are here, because we can't cheat. They're kind of forced to be down, so when you're squeezing, my knees can't go anywhere because they're pinched against each other. Hips are turned in. Join us. We're running out of room. Feel free to throw anything out of the way. So the inner thigh engaging, hips turning in. Can you guys feel that a little bit? Try this. Thumbs forward. When you squeeze, they should turn in just a little bit. Like I said, that hip tends to be at this angle. There's the femur head, neck. This is what I call the trochanter. Some of us are really rotated. So when we stand, we're kind of rotated here. And we're like, oh, I gotta get my neck back. Then that pelvic structure is forward. So the hip doesn't line up with the shoulder. You guys see that a little bit? The hips are very turned out. So that's very posterior pelvic tilt, glute centric. So I have to shut off the glutes, kind of relax my shoulders, tighten in and then lift. I like to pretend like Chris Farley when he puts on that little guy's coat in that movie. He has to really suck in to get that button and then zip. A lot of people say, just zip up, right? When they do this, but they let all this engagement go. So we have to engage first, then zip the coat. And that shortens all this. So in this position, you can see everything's shortened back here. All that fascia is pulling towards each other. And that pushes into the spine. Forces us to bend here versus our hips. All right, I'll join you again. So feet wide. This can be a little rough on the knees. You kind of get used to it after a while. It's not so bad for the knees. You would think it would be. So here.
Depends on how old you are.
Right. I'm 60. I just do a lot of foundation training. Pull up into that sphere of tension. Got your feet nice and wide. Make sure your toes are kind of tucking in. Yeah, you want that gripping, what we call dorsiflexion, pulling in. Everything engaged, right? Because then my feet can push off a little bit. My knees are pushing off. They're squeezing. Try to pop my head off. Good. Pull that up overhead. No spine motion. Breathe into it. I always forget to breathe. Good. Right up. Let's try a little different one here. So go to that measuring stick hands again, lengthen. We're going to hinge over top of the right hip. So the hip's pulling back, torso's flexing over top. You should feel that right foot really pushing into the ground, gripping. Just like I'm always telling you to get grip with your hands, you need to train the feet to do that too. Because a lot of our problems, our diseases, come from the foot. Because we don't use the foot anymore. Everything's flat. We wear shoes all day long. It doesn't work. When the foot doesn't work, the hip doesn't work, spine compresses, nervous system stress, you die. Okay. Long wing, short wing. There, I just connected all the darts for you. Breathe better, all diseases go away. Don't quote me on that. You guys feel that more? Lengthened you are, you'll feel that a lot. Let's scoop up. Let's do a couple of those rotations. The more length you get in your spine, the more you're going to feel that. Bruce feels it. Sorry, Bruce. Your face was just perfect. That's what I want you to feel. Bruce and I have worked together a lot. Let's go left over the right. Get that angle. You should feel that left hip flexor. Back to center. Let's go back to that little inward squeeze here. And let's switch it up. Left forward. You don't want the knee going past the ankle. So when I tell you to hinge forward, it's all from the hip. We don't want that knee coming with us. Another thing we use a lot is too much knee motion. So either in line with the heel, or I actually like it back a little bit. The more I pull it back, you'll find the hamstring tension. It's the same as the woodpecker when we're standing. We have the hamstring tension on the front. That's the stretch. Stretch here. Anytime we're getting a good stretch without really moving, that's what we call an active stretch. So something is engaging to help stretch. So when you're squeezing, trying to push the ground away, you're engaging a lot. You're engaging your spine. You're opening up the disc space. Taking pressure off the nerves. Sphere of tension. Let's hinge. Maybe go up a little higher, push those hips back. Rotate off to the left. Should feel that really in that front left hip. Probably a good stretch in the front of the right hip, but kind of in the socket of that left. Good. Let's bring it overhead. You can bring it overhead at that angle to hit one side of the spine. A lot of fatigue right here in the front right quad. All right, let it go, shake it off. So when you're getting up and off the ground, this is a good way, because then you're really stiffening your spine so you can always lift, push nice and slow. For me, I always get up with my left. I like to watch little kids. They always favor one leg. So if you know which side you favor, guess what? Do it on the other side. So my right, I can tell, like it's just harder. So I take it slow, turn it into an exercise. You guys notice one leg harder than the other? Well, oh, there's something on the ground. You always do this. You always go right forward, switch it up, and also think about these mechanics. Hinging, grabbing. So let's go over that founder. I'm gonna go show you from the side now. Give you all a different angle. So we'll start shoulder width apart, measuring stick hands. Watching you now, you're in trouble. Chest broad, belly button pulling into the spine. Don't engage the glutes just yet. That's when we come up here. That's when I squeeze, pulling those glutes in, lifting the back of the skull. And as soon as I do this, my feet kind of grip. We're not used to kind of stacking our weight in our heels. Our hips kind of want to be. Yes. When you're kneeling, you should be falling forwards. When you're standing, you should be falling backwards. But please don't fall backwards. But sometimes when I do it, you'll watch me, I kind of catch myself. Because you really should be kind of pushing in there, and then you kind of find that middle gray area where you're not falling over, but you're finding that tension. Here, I'll fall over for you. I'll show you what it looks like. Even here, it's like I'm trying to knock myself backwards. The more my weight shifts back into my heels, the more my arches activate. So then when I hinge, pushes me backwards. So I'll just fight for it. But you should, if you're falling backwards, I'm saying you're doing something right. You're getting it. There's no failure here. So pulling back, arches really gripping. Don't let those toes come up in the air. Inhale here, you're expanding widthwise. And then you're exhaling with that platter, sinking deeper. Elbows moving away from the hips. Inhale, expanding. Exhale, deeper. Don't let your knees go past your ankles. Don't lock your knees out either. Turn your feet in, unlock your knees. A little bend, right? Little bend. You see the little bend? That's the hamstring. If I'm locking out, I'm gonna feel it in my calf, and my lumbar spine is flexing. I've lost that activation and length. Let's go narrow. Big toes together, heels 2 inches apart, 3 at most. Measuring stick hands, lengthen, lifting. You could try this here, that hip hugger, squeezing the inner thighs together. Then we're gonna set that neck, pushes our weight back into the heels where the arches are activating, gripping the ground, hinging deeper. Inhale, expand, exhale, sink. Keep going, don't stop. I'm just gonna get some ideas. That looks really good. You too, Bruce, a little bend in those knees. Oh, you're good. You're good, you're good. Okay, relax. So with the knees, when we're here, a little subtle bend, we're not locking them out. See the difference? Not there. As soon as I bring back, a lot of people want to lock their knees out. I'm keeping the knees planted right where they are. So the only thing moving is the hip structure. The knees stay there. That's where you'll find you want to fall backwards. Because the knees they want to help out. They're so used to helping out. That's why we get a lot of knee problems. It's not the knee that's the problem, it's the hip. Fix the hip, but fix your knee problems. Make sense there with that? Once you're lengthened, you get that little bend in the knee, it's not going anymore. Try not to isolate all that motion at the hips. Getting that length out of the spine. Same thing with the arms. If you find that you're locking your elbows out, because you can see where my shoulders are at here, they're too high, you've done something wrong. So you're always going to have that little bend. I'm trying to straighten them out, it just won't happen. The only way it happens is if I let those shoulders go. You see the difference? But you'll feel it. It's what you feel. It's not about looking right, it's about feeling it. I feel like that's a bad spiritual lesson for you pastors in here. Let's do the woodpecker. Left foot forward. I actually like to, if you notice that right foot always wants to turn out, you can rotate by just bringing that right arm up. That usually sets that hip. And this is the archer position. So set your neck. After you've set your hip, set your neck. Take your right thumb, put it in your palm. And we're gonna open up, keep your eyes looking out like you're pulling a bow. Bring that right thumb into your right armpit. Turn, get a good stretch, opening up the pelvis. Breathe out. Don't fall. Let's do the reverse. So we're gonna hinge, other arm. So now we're closing the hips. Let's do a couple there. This one we're kind of in that woodpecker position. Pushing that hand, pulling. And a lot of this stuff you might want to save. It's to help rotational imbalances that we have, like one hip's turned more than the other. Most people, we need to first lengthen the spine, but it's good to have these in your mind. So you're like, man, that left hip doesn't feel right. Try some of these. You'll notice right away, left to right, which is harder. Gives you an idea what to work on. If it's harder, you work on it, right? Because what's easier, it goes back to that autonomic nervous system. It's going to automatically happen when you're not thinking about it. When you're sleeping, not just accessory breathing, but also the position you're laying in is based on what muscles are short. If they want to be short, they don't want to be stretched during your sleeping, so they're going to find that weird contorted position, and you wake up with something injured. Like, how did I get injured while I was sleeping? Muscles pulling all night long. And it's not just that night, it's the last decade of nights. Injury over time. It's like a car wreck happening over 10, 20 years. How we move. It's important. Switch it up. What do we do? Left? Let's go right. Try those again. Same process as before. Obviously, I can't say every step every time, and you're going to add more the more you do it. Think about those 3 points of contact. Gripping the ground, your pair of scissors, inner thighs pulling. Don't lock that knee out. Try to find that hamstring tension on the right. Stretch on the left hip, just as before. Set the neck, squeeze the glutes. The more you repeat it, the more you're going to get it. Let's do that archer again. So we're opening up that left hip. This one's obviously harder for me. I figured out which harder. If you're off balance, that's the tougher side. So focus on that. I feel that. It's cramping up there. Left hip. Okay, I found out what's tough. And then the normal archer, that's the reverse archer. This is the woodpecker. Opening. Sorry, this is the reversed archer. That was the normal archer. Nobody shoots a bow like this. You could tell I'm not a bow hunter. I just crack people's backs. Good, guys. Questions on that? Good. So now that we've woken up the hips, try a squat, see how it feels. It should be a little more hip-centric. Think about your knees. If your knees are kind of going over the toes and your spine's kind of bent a little bit, that's not so good. Think about, I want to get more hip motion, because we should have freed them up a little bit more. Pull into those hips, less knee, at least starting that initial motion from the hip joints. Not letting, you'll feel that pressure in your knees sometimes, like, ooh, pressure's in the knees versus in the hips. And you're gonna hit this wall about here, because you can get lower, but watch my spine. I tucks, and I hunch. I look like Gollum from Lord of the Rings. And it's okay to get down there. It's actually good to do a bit of that flat foot squat. Maybe not for you right now, but for you, you know, probably the more you're protecting it, if you just go here, just working on that, right? Just a little bit. And you can even make that just a little bit hard. It's all from the hips. You're not letting your spine do any work. And that's the initial part of that hinge we did before, right? So that's the goal, is to train those hips. It's not going to fix it all in one session, but it should feel a little easier to go down there, a little more natural. It's definitely better than, you know, where the spine bends. But even that, you can kind of hinge. Spine stays a little straighter, driving up on that hip. I'm not saying you have to do this all the time, but that's the goal, is your body should automatically want to approach things better. You just have to train yourself out of it. Strengthening, training. Do we have a model that would like to come up here so we could point out some of the shortened fascia that we're all dealing with? Ginger, you want to. You're great. You're just going to stand there. I won't make you do anything. So turn to your left. So Ginger's hips come forward like we were talking about. Hips turn out a little bit. That's just pretty standard with all of us. Unless she's hurt this here, she's going to come here to engage the hip flexors more. Come back to that position. Don't think about what I said. Just let it go.
So be normal.
Be normal. So this hip, as we call the trochanter, I'm really scared, should line up with here. So if you look at it from the side, hips are a little forward. So that's going to force her to lift her spine with her shoulders. And I can feel these are very tight because she's doing that all day long, and that's she's going to breathe from the shoulders. That's all these run up to her skull and her neck. And we have to work on that. And then the spine, too, is another thing. So the more this shifts forward, the more the spine cannot lift. She has to lift it with her shoulders. It's not being driven up by her pelvic structure. So what I'm trying to get you to do is pull your weight in your heels. You should feel your feet kind of work. You can bring your head back. I got you.
What do you want me to do?
And just lift your torso up. There you go. So she's pulling the belly in. She's lifting. See her feet raise. Now grip the ground. Hold there. So the hips are working more. Now try to keep your hips there and put your torso and head over top of your hips. So right there, without bending too much.
Okay.
Right? You feel the backwards fall?
Yes.
Harder, just holding yourself there. Again, I don't want you to be this way all the time. We're just kind of overtraining it. You have to overtrain. Of course, you're supposed to be able to bend at your spine. I'm just trying to train you not to do it right now, so you'll have more balance throughout the rest of your life. Good. And you look pretty symmetrical, so turn, face them. Actually, turn the other way. Face there. Arms down. She's level because she sees her chiropractor. So I like to say is, this is my job. So if she was like standing here like this, like that's my job to fix. You could address a lot of that with all that twisting stuff you're doing, that spiraling, because that can, if one side's like that, her spine is like a towel that you've twisted. So she's pretty good in this plane, but in the side, you got some problems. Turn to your right, feet, whole body. Hips are just slightly forward. And that's just picking on her, but we're all really similar to that. Unless we've had an injury, that's when we start kind of rounding and pulling forward and these other problems. So the good news is all our postural patterns are kind of similar, and they all kind of come from the same problem. So this addresses everything. Posterior pelvic tilt, anterior pelvic tilt, whatever you have, we need to lengthen, open up the spine. Thank you, you're good. Questions on that? That make any sense? So the hips turn out, and then the shoulders like to do the opposite. So even though she was doing this, it looks like her shoulders were back. Even though the shoulder blades are back, we still have this joint that's really turned in. So when we're doing that long wing, when we get broad, that's the only really time we can really isolate what we call the glenohumeral joint motion. Because we have scapular motion, which is everything. And a lot of us abuse that. We abuse the spine. Don't actually train this. So rotator cuff's job holds it in the socket. There's a rotator cuff with a hip, holds it in the socket. So our hips like to turn out, shoulders like to turn in. It's this cascade. So as the hips come forward, those turn out, the shoulders, then we're like, oh, I'm hunched, I gotta do this. And it looks better, but you didn't actually fix a single thing, you made it worse. Right? That's a hard lesson for a lot of people. Hard lesson for me, because I used to be like that. I was called upward cross, lower cross syndrome. So what I would do is I was very arched, like I would just do this. And I used to run like this. I was very bad. I had a lot of problems, but a lot of it came from my feet. I kept trying to fix my feet. It wasn't until I fixed my hips that my feet got better, because I shattered both my heels. I had some surgery. So I was like, oh, I just kept trying to strengthen my feet. I was, and the feet were the problem, but it was everything. And anytime you have an injury, you're like, oh, it's this stupid knee, it's this stupid toe. It's everything. You got to think it's everything. Especially with organ disease, too, because a lot of that can come from neurological stress, which comes from mechanical stress. So think whole body. You got a disc problem, think whole body. It's not just that disc. You're like, oh, I'm just going to go get some surgery, get that disc fixed. But there's all this other instability that goes along with it. Questions? Want to repeat any of those exercises? Where's that handout? I don't think I brought enough copies. But if some of you are technologically inclined, there's a little link back here. QR code.
Yep. Oh, you can get those apps on your.
So that'll take you to my channel, but also I recommend checking out Foundation Training. They have a couple free videos on there. There's one called Independence from Pain, which will go over that one we did. That's the woodpecker.
That's a really good one.
That spiral. You want, yeah, with the dog in it. Don't get distracted by the dog.
Right, that one.
Everyone's like, the video with the dog, right? Yeah. You're watching the dog the whole time. Yeah.
That looks like the one, right?
But yeah, woodpecker. But these are all we went over. I added some little things just to throw some flair on there. But the first video on this QR code is just a little, I think it's less than 7 minutes. You could follow me along through it, but eventually it's just you make up your own little morning workout. I'm not saying you have to do whatever I do. I just want you to think just 5 minutes in the morning. Why in the morning? Because you're setting yourself to move better throughout the day. It's okay if you do it at night, but definitely better in the morning, because you're shutting off what's tight, you're activating what's weak. That's the goal. Move better a little bit each day. You don't want to do an hour of this stuff. It's going to kill you. You can, maybe once a week, that's good. There's a couple of those on the Foundation Training website. They usually do like a monthly workout. It's more like half an hour.
Oh, yeah.
And the creator, Dr. Goodman's there. He's usually sweating and shaking, because he's been doing it for 8 years, so he's better at it, which makes him worse at it. The more you do it, the harder it becomes, because the more you get at isolating the hip motion, isolating the shoulder motion, holding the length in the spine. So you get better and better at that the more you do it. The less you're going to use the flexion extension of the spine, the more you're going to be little cues like your feet, everything working together. So breathing, we'll start with breathing. To remind you to breathe through the rest of these, because a lot of people hold the breath. No, we're trying to breathe. Even if it should feel restricted, like we were talking about at the beginning. That breath is, it's hard because you're pushing into those tight areas. Because normally you want to breathe, and we just skip the tight areas. We do this, right? Especially young kids, I check their breathing. I'm like, give me a breath. They're like, do that. So that's a very dysfunctional breath. It shows me that there's a lot wrong neurologically. Breathing is tied to so many things. Our teeth, sicknesses. So breathing from the pelvic floor diaphragm, engaging there, not with the shoulder region. So that's what you're doing there on the floor. You're anchoring the arms so they can't go. You're thinking about using your diaphragm, your pelvic floor. It also puts you in a little bit more of a rounded position, so you can lengthen out of that versus a lot of us are here. So it's hard for us to kind of pull in. Who's been to the office where I have to give them the hug? You know what I'm talking about? Where I lay you back on my hand, the smash. The reason for that is when you're laying down, like with your hips being forward a little bit, you're now forced to be level. It makes that mid-back, the spine, very stiff. So I can't actually move it. So what I have to do is I have to put you in a flex position to actually open up those spinal joints. And then I add the length. And you're doing the same exact thing with the standing. So first you got to kind of find that restriction, drive into it, versus just coming back here with the breathing, right? Because then the spine is coming here, and it's just kind of stuck in that position. So we got to open it, lengthen it. Right there, it felt a lot. Same with the foam roller. That's why you get like, a lot of pops with that. If you're foam rolling, do this stuff. Maybe even before. Warm up your muscles, foam roll, then strengthen. A lot of us spend all night stretching, stretching, stretching. This is good because we're stretching and we're strengthening. So we're getting the best of both worlds. And that's going to make the change. Stretching can alleviate the problem, but it's going to come back because you never addressed what's weak. Thought you had a question. So if you want to copy these, good.
Because I mean, I'm stretching all the time and it still hurts, so.
You're not alone. Not alone. It's really annoying, right? You're stretching, stretching. Sometimes you're stretching what feels tight, and it's taut, making it worse. It feels good at the time. So this is definitely safer than a lot of things. It's a very good way to start, especially if you're doing heavy lifting. This will train your spine to be strong when you're lifting heavy. Because barbell stuff is really good. I'm actually a big supporter of that because you're driving something overhead. Usually, you know, you got them over there and your feet are driving, you're pushing up against it. That's all decompression, which is good. Problem is if you flex, extend, you're lifting here, you know, you never actually drove up. So it's good. We just want to teach the principles here. There's nothing special about these exercises. I chose them because I think they're just got some good variety, but it's not what you do, it's how you do it. So people ask me, like, what's the magical exercise? There is none. Because I could say go walk, but walking could be just as destructive as anything else. Swimming even, right? You're the swimming master. We've had lots of conversations. It's not that swimming's bad. I'm not saying you can't swim anymore. But just because it's an anti-gravity exercise doesn't mean it's going to solve the problem of what's weak, because your dominances are going to work in the water the same way they would work if you're standing on the ground. Who wants a copy? Questions? The wording is very strange. It'll make sense the more you do it. I got 3 more. Again, if you want to just scan this with your phone, then you,
I think you
Yeah.
gave me one at the office.
yeah.
I have it in the truck, so.
And if you come to the office, I can just give you one on Monday or whenever you come in. Yes. It's just good to have something physical.